I'm going to be talking to Ralph Torrie, who has co-authored a study for Energy Efficiency Canada about retrofitting buildings to meet Canadian climate goals. There's a lot of work to do, and Ralph has suggested a new model for approaching this problem. So welcome to the interview, Ralph.
Thank you. Pleased to do it. Pleased to be here. And thanks
Well,
for
look,
your interest in this.
maybe we could start, Ralph, with an overview of the study, please.
Yeah, I mean, this started out actually a year ago when I did some work for Corporate Knights magazine on what a post-pandemic economic recovery might look like for Canada if it was focused on being a green recovery. And we looked at a very high level at what the building's energy retrofit component would look like, what the electricity system changes might look like, how we could build back better from the pandemic in a way that would address the climate crisis and be a green recovery. And one of those components of that work was this overview of what we could do to retrofit the buildings in Canada. And Efficiency Canada approached me after we did that work and said, could you expand on this and look at it province by province? And so we rolled up our sleeves and spent a good part of the past year taking what had started out as a fairly fast and quick analysis of what might be possible and doing it in quite a lot of depth province by province to see what is the potential to reduce emissions, to get off fossil fuels in our buildings, and do it in a way that created jobs and would give us better buildings and an economic boost at the same time.
Right. Now, what you've advocated for, your recommendation in the study, is a climate retrofit mission. Could you explain that, please?
The idea, the word mission is taken after the work of an American academic named Mariana Mazzucato, who's a very sort of hot intellectual property right now in that world, who is advocating that when society has a really big and difficult challenge to face, we need to organize across the sectors, across the public and the private sectors, engaging civil society, and take it on as a mission. And it needs to have an inspiring objective. It needs to engage across a wide spectrum of society. It needs to have a possible objective, but it has to be one that stretches us and in some way forces us to do a rethink on business as usual. And one thinks the obvious example is the man on the moon mission that President Kennedy established in the early 60s, but there have been other examples. And that's really what we concluded after we looked at the retrofit challenges. This is going to require such a change up from the way we normally make improvements to our homes and our buildings that it requires a complete reset of the way that the building sector deals with old buildings and existing buildings.
Well, let's talk about how that might roll out. So you've got a number of promising solutions, as you call them, and integrated design and project delivery, prefabrication of building components, aggregation of similar buildings into large-scale projects. Can you give us some concrete examples of how those things might work, what they are?
Well, essentially, it's the difference between, the metaphor I like to use, it's the difference between the way Model Ts were being built in 1910 and the way they were being built 10 years later in 1920. We need to go from the current situation where every building retrofit is a customized, bespoke job, where the building owner, the homeowner, or the building owner is having to raise the capital, often manage the process themselves with different contractors coming in. It can disrupt the building for weeks and sometimes months as the process unfolds, and it's very expensive. We got quotes of like $100,000 or more to do a single family dwelling. And it'll be just impossibly expensive unless we can find a way basically to industrialize the process so that we can get economies of scale by doing lots of houses, so that we can save money on the job sites by grouping similar houses together and doing them in groups, so that we can aggregate the capital expenditure and take it to investors and to the financial markets. Instead of saying, how would you like to finance a $100,000 retrofit? We can say, how would you like to finance a $50 million project to do this many thousands of houses? That's the kind of change that it's going to take. And so we have the technology to, I would say, to pretty much a complete extent. The challenges here are we have to take the upfront risk away from the building owner. We have to take the upfront capital burden away from the building owner. We have to make this easy and convenient, and we have to keep the total cost of ownership from going up through all of this. So it's a big challenge, but we do it for all kinds of other expensive things. So, we were quite excited by the prospect of the mission approach to this.
Where will the leadership come from, Ralph? Is this something that the government has to provide leadership on with enabling legislation and policy and regulations, or is this something that can come out of the communities, out of municipalities, those kinds of things?
I think that this is an issue where the leadership is already bubbling up from the bottom. We've seen there's currently lots of innovation going on across Canada in different ways that we can organize to do more retrofits, to do them deeper, to do them faster, to finance them in an aggregate way. All of the major cities have got groups that are working in this space. So I think, yes, we need leadership from the government, but it's not like there isn't already a body of leading opinion and leading practices that they can build on. So government's job here is to identify where they can facilitate this process and help accelerate it. And I think that when you look at it that way, you say, well, having the public investor involved is going to be key, because we need to try and do this with the lowest possible interest rates. And I think that facilitating those kinds of innovative financing approaches is a key role for government. The recent move by the federal government, for example, to include commercial building retrofits in the mandate of the Infrastructure Bank is a good example of how government can help the sector help itself. There's lots of people just raring to get started on this, and we just need to bridge the gap that exists between the idea and what needs to happen to accelerate progress on the ground.
Final question, Ralph. And let me give you an example. Maybe we can kind of work our way through a real world example. So my wife and I live in a community, it's a strata in BC of, let's say 50 detached houses. And they're 30 years old, roughly. And everybody's beginning to, replace roofs and windows and those sorts of things. So it seems to be a really good example of the kind of collection of houses, of buildings that meet your criteria. I think we'd be a prime target for that. So I'm sitting here thinking, well, this is great. Ralph's got a really wonderful idea. How do we get started on this? How does my community of 50 homes, how do we do this?
Well, I think I would like to see that question put back to the community, but with lots of support in answering it. I don't think that there's a one size fits all for how this could happen. But it's interesting, the point you made in asking that question about the amount of money that we already are spending on our houses. It's a very large number. Canadians spend about $60 billion a year, $60 billion a year renovating their houses. And they spend another $40 billion on fuel and electricity. So we're spending much more money now than we're proposing in our study. What's required is that we integrate these objectives of energy efficiency and low emissions into those renovations that are already taking place, which, let's face it, are usually about kitchens and bathrooms or roofs that need replacing and are not necessarily focused on energy efficiency or emission reduction. So partly what we need to do, I think, is to, in a community like yours, say, look, what I would like to see, for example, is a number of multi-million-dollar financing opportunities being put on the table for communities that can come forward and say, all right, we've got our local community college and our local builders and our local government and a number of homeowners who are interested in being the first to do this together. And if we've got, let's say, $20 million of financing, here's our proposal for how we could do a deep climate retrofit on the buildings in our community. Let's say in your case, did you say 50?
Yes.
50 buildings? That's a, that's a reasonable size for the kind of pilot that we're talking about. And so that might be 50 buildings. I mean, that might be, what would that be? A $5 million project, perhaps, something like that. And the financing would be made available to you as well. It's not to say you don't pay it back, but if you design your program in a way that the paying back the cost of doing this comes out of the savings in fuel and electricity costs that will result from the investments themselves, then we can keep the total cost of ownership for everybody from going up. And we do this all the time. I mean, we don't ask people to write a check when we want to build a new power plant or a new highway. We find ways that it gets paid for over time. And that's what we need with the retrofit challenge. We need to industrialize it, and we need to have these innovative approaches to the way that it gets financed and paid for. They'll pay for themselves. Fundamentally, this is a smart thing to do economically. We just don't have the financing infrastructure that we need to support communities like yours in getting on with it.
Ralph, thank you very much for this. I really appreciate your insights.
Oh, thank you for your interest.